Deep Sea Embers Chapter 261 to 270. As Nina was about to rush to the second floor to summon her uncle, Duncan appeared on the stairs, having heard the noise and come on his own accord. Mr. Duncan, Morris approached the stairs, gazing up at the captain, who was looking down. I found a symbol similar to the one you showed me in a document about the ancient kingdom of Crete. Duncan noticed the faint redness in Morris's eyes and the slight swelling of his eyelids. It seemed the old scholar had exerted great effort to find this information. There was a hint of excitement in his eyes, and he appeared unusually energized, the kind of spirit that arises from being immersed in research and making progress. Duncan glanced at Nina and Alice downstairs and gave a slight nod. You all keep an eye on the store. He then looked at Morris. Let's go upstairs and talk. The old man, holding the large book, stepped onto the stairs. The ancient wooden steps creaked as he followed Duncan to the master bedroom on the second floor, his first time in this location. By the standards of a subspace shadow dwelling, the bedroom was somewhat plain, but given Mr. Duncan's unusual hobby of playing immortal, the simplicity of the room seemed quite fitting. Morris carefully controlled his actions, indulging his curiosity without being overly intrusive before being told to sit after Duncan pulled two chairs from the side, gesturing for him to place the large book on the desk by the window. Tell me about your discovery, Duncan said after sitting down. What does that symbol represent? As for its meaning, I have no clue yet. I just found its most likely origin. Morris composed himself, opening the valuable-looking document, and turned to the page with a bookmark. Take a look at this spot. It appears here. Duncan frowned slightly as he saw a drawing on that page, a rather exquisite hand-drawn illustration, depicting part of a large building that resembled the main entrance of a palace. The symbol, framed by a hexagon with a broken cross structure, appeared in the relief above the main entrance, taking up the center of the entire image. As for the content of the scribbles, it seemed to be just some patterns with no discernible meaning. Ads by PubFuture. As Morris had mentioned earlier, the symbol was in a very inconspicuous place. It was merely a small decorative element of an illustration, occupying less than a tenth of the entire image, without any special emphasis. It was astonishing that Morris could find this book among a stack of documents and this tiny detail within the book. I have a vague impression that I saw it a long, long time ago. Thanks to the blessing of the God of Wisdom, this impression still works today, allowing me to find this little thing, Morris explained. This illustration is a copy, and its original first appeared in a document about the study of ancient Crete architectural relics. That document is not currently in plan, but I believe some of my academic friends should be able to help. Of course, even without the original, the content recorded in this book is useful. It mentions that the hand-drawn illustration portrays a lost ruin that once stood in a bordering sea area. The ruin was situated on an unnamed deserted island, which mysteriously vanished into thick fog around the year 223 of the new city-state era. Before its complete disappearance, several expeditions successfully landed on the island and verified the structure and age of the ruin, confirming that it was from the ancient Crete era. Based on the surface patterns and reliefs of the building, the entire structure likely had both academic and religious significance. As he spoke, Morris pointed to the text on the adjacent page of the illustration. Between the slightly yellowed pages, one could see the annotations written by the old scholar in his earlier years. The bold, deep lines of the symbols and the abundant rhombus elements in the patterns are characteristic of ancient Crete architecture. They revered a strong and powerful architectural style, with the main body of their palace buildings mostly in various rectangular or pyramid shapes. This building aligns perfectly with these characteristics. As Duncan listened to Mr. Morris's interpretation, his gaze slowly scanned the drawings and sentences. His attention returned to the hexagonal pattern in the center of the main entrance relief, his brow furrowing slightly. Regarding this symbol, is there no specific interpretation? Unfortunately, this document is only a general introduction and does not involve a detailed interpretation of the various details of the ruins. Morris shook his head. But this is an inevitable situation. The ancient Crete kingdom is 10,000 years old, and the remaining ruins are few and most severely damaged. With the loss or contamination of various materials, the knowledge available for later generations to analyze is fragmented, making it difficult for us to find an article specifically studying a pattern on a particular gate of the ancient kingdom. Academic or religious facilities, entrance symbols. Duncan thoughtfully stroked his chin. Why would a group of ascetics 10,000 years later carry a charm from the time of the ancient Crete kingdom? November LBJNN. He turned to Morris. Do you think it's possible that there is a Crete remnant that has survived for 10,000 years? Some people say that a rigorous scholar should not blindly dismiss any possibility, even if the probability is extremely low, but from my personal perspective, I genuinely think it's improbable. Morris cautiously said as he pondered. A group resembling ascetics, possibly very few in number. Extremely secretive in their activities, enduring the great chaos after the collapse of the ancient kingdom. The age of strife, the old city-state wars, and preserving their lineage for a full 10,000 years without either breaking the line of descent or being discovered. If this possibility were to be true, I would rather believe they are a secret religious group established in modern times who happened to discover some ancient documents or similar ruins and adopted a symbol from the Crete period as their own emblem. This possibility seems even more likely. Ads by PubFuture. Duncan listened to the old man's thoughts, humming noncommittally, and his gaze swept over the text once more. In the materials, some paragraphs were clearly quoted from the records in the original manuscript, describing the fragmented words left by the explorers more than 1,000 years ago. It stands in the center of the island, the main building and surrounding auxiliary buildings almost occupying the entire island, as if the island was specifically created for this building. The main material of the building appears to be stone, but stronger than stone, with a pale color. Soldiers tried to chisel open one of the wall bricks with an ice pick and succeeded only after much effort. The collision between the ice pick and the wall brick produced exaggerated sparks, and the broken part of the wall brick had a silvery gray texture. There are several small islands nearby, all desolate with sparse vegetation and few insects, no remaining buildings. Perhaps there were some, but they were too small in scale and had already been devoured by time. On the third evening, a small boat patrolled around the island and found that a collapsed point that had previously been above water was now submerged. But there was no sign of a rising tide. Fog began to form in the nearby waters. The priest had a bad feeling, and after praying to the god of death, Bartok, and seeking guidance, he advised us to leave the island immediately. Duncan looked directly at the end of this quote, where the author of the document recorded, on the 7th day after the exploration team withdrew, the fog dissipated, and another team arrived in the vicinity of the area, but the nameless island could no longer be found. So it was swallowed by the thick fog. Duncan sighed softly, unable to suppress his regret. It sounds like the result of a border collapse. It does seem that way, but at that time, there was no mature sacred emblem navigation technology or sufficiently accurate observation methods, so several abnormal phenomena, including border collapses and fog devouring, were easily confused. Fog devouring phenomenon. Duncan recalled briefly and found the corresponding knowledge in his mind. He had been learning about this common knowledge through books lately. If it really was a fog-devouring phenomenon, then this island might reappear briefly in a similar dense fog in the future, but it seems that there are no records of such an occurrence. Indeed, but it is also possible that the relevant materials were lost. Duncan hummed in agreement, his fingers involuntarily brushing over the illustration, touching the tiny broken cross mark on it. This drawing, there shouldn't be any possibility of the copyist taking liberties, right? He suddenly asked uneasily. I don't think so, Morris immediately replied. This is a very rigorous documentary material. The original manuscript's illustrator and the compiler are known for their rigor as academic authorities. When they copy these materials, they would rather leave the unclear parts untouched for future generations than make any supplementary adjustments without evidence. In other words, even if they made adjustments, they would certainly explain the corresponding situation in the notes. It's authentic and verifiable, Duncan murmured thoughtfully. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. In the extensive collection of literature provided by Morris, only a small portion was related to the enigmatic symbol, and that symbol was merely an unassuming element of this tiny section, as the author hardly dedicated any effort to explaining the symbol or its associated relief patterns. Duncan and Morris were limited to examining the details displayed in the manuscript illustrations, cautiously concluding that the shattered cross encircled by a hexagonal border was probably a religious symbol or scholarly emblem from the ancient kingdom era. From a logical standpoint, Morris doubted that the ascetics who visited the vanished a century ago could be descendants of the ancient kingdom. The odds of a group of hermits surviving and preserving their lineage for 10 millennia during the tumultuous and perilous deep-sea era were virtually non-existent. From a rigorous academic perspective, he couldn't make such a claim without additional evidence. Nonetheless, Duncan instinctively felt that a powerful link must have existed between those ascetics and the ancient Crete kingdom. They possessed the mysterious emblem and attached great importance to it, suggesting that they were aware of its meaning. Of course, in the absence of proof, all conjectures were mere speculation. At this point, unless the ascetics re-emerged before Duncan, their origins would remain undetermined. How many well-preserved Crete artifacts have been discovered and still exist in the world? Duncan inquired suddenly after shitting the large tome book. Very few artifacts have been unearthed, so few that you could count them on one hand. As for well-preserved, it depends on your definition of well-preserved, Morris replied. For those researching the ancient kingdom, discovering a large pit confirmed to be connected to Crete, finding intact wall bricks longer than 10 meters, or even just a couple of toppled stone doors on the ground would be considered well-preserved. At this point, the elderly scholar couldn't help but lament. Normally, relics within a city-state's jurisdiction aren't likely to be conserved. We attempt to document them through text and images, capturing every detail, and then gather the artifacts for examination in research institutions. Ultimately, the relics themselves are flattened, buried, and integrated into the city. Duncan contemplated for a moment, murmuring to himself, "Land is as valuable as gold." Morris agreed. We study history, preserve history, and endeavor to remember the past as it fades, but we can't let the past encroach on our living space. The new city-states have been in existence for nearly 2 millennia. During the height of the exploration era, new islands were often discovered, bringing forth uncharted wildernesses and ancient ruins to light. However, over the past century or two, such discoveries have become almost non-existent. The initial new islands eventually evolved into city-states, and there's only so much land to be found in the vast ocean. The remaining relics are either on barren islands with inhospitable conditions or concealed by extraordinary forces, or situated on the fringes of dangerous anomalies. As a result, even the Church of the Four Gods can only briefly investigate them before marking them as sealed on their maps. Duncan remained quiet for an extended period, his thoughts still on the symbol and its underlying literature. You mentioned earlier that your academic friends might be able to uncover more information related to this symbol. I have a friend in Lanza who is an expert on the ancient kingdom's history, and he was my classmate when I studied at the Academy of Truth, Morris confirmed, gesturing to the large book on the table. He gifted me this book many years ago, and I recall he mentioned relevant literature back then. I've sent a letter, but I'm unsure when I'll get a reply. Ads by PubFuture. Duncan sighed. We'll wait patiently and let things unfold naturally. Subsequently, he and Morris discussed various aspects of the ancient Crete kingdom, the scattered discoveries, the enigmatic and peculiar legends, and the partially true, partially fabricated ancient scrolls that blurred the lines between reality and myth. After an engaging conversation, it was time for Morris to bid farewell and depart. I promised my wife I'd be home for lunch, the elderly scholar said with a smile. If I return too late, I'll face scolding from both my wife and daughter. Duncan laughed. It seems you find joy in it. Morris chuckled, nodded, donned his hat, and carried the large book under his arm, leaving with Duncan. Nina was counting a few banknotes behind the counter, with Alice observing curiously, and Shirley was nowhere to be seen, likely out playing. As Duncan descended the stairs, Nina patiently educated the bewildered Alice about currency. You see, this one with the golden corner is a sora, and here's the denomination. These coins are pesos, and the number on the front is the denomination. Don't bite it, it's dirty. Business seems to be thriving today. Duncan eyed the money in Nina's hand, raising an eyebrow. Usually, it's not this busy. Yeah, I'm not sure why, but business has been booming today. Nina cheerfully waved the banknotes at Duncan. It appears to be related to Alice. Duncan was taken aback, With Alice. A kind elderly woman who left earlier mentioned it, Nina explained with a grin. She said that having an employee like Alice in the store makes the items on the shelves seem more authentic. Duncan. He gazed silently at Alice, who returned a puzzled look. Ads by PubFuture. However, Miss Doll was oblivious to the situation. She was still trying to memorize the banknotes, appearance and learning to count money. At Nobleman at. I didn't anticipate Alice serving this purpose here, Duncan pondered for a while before abruptly turning to Morris. Would you like to take something with you when you leave? Ah, Morris was slightly surprised. I hadn't planned on it when I left home. No charge, think of it as a token of appreciation for your efforts in searching for the literature. Duncan smiled and approached the counter, selecting a crystal pendant from the shelf, identical to the one he had previously given Morris as a gift, since he had an entire box of them. I recall you mentioning that your daughter's pendant was damaged. This one is for you. Morris observed the pendant in Duncan's hand, watching the magnificent crystal, a symbol of modern industry, gently sway in midair, its surface casting a kaleidoscope of colors. His thoughts turned to the extraordinary experiences Heidi had recounted upon her return. The sobering events during the city-state's disintegration, witnessing the divergence of two historical paths and the erasure of one, and the protection provided by the amulet. Only now did he understand that Captain Duncan had offered his goodwill so early on without his awareness. I hope this amulet continues to bring good fortune to Miss Heidi, Duncan said with a smile. Take it, you've earned it. Morris solemnly accepted the crystal pendant and expressed his appreciation. But Duncan seemed to have another idea and pondered, if you bring this pendant back, you'll undoubtedly be nagged by your daughter, and this time your wife will join in. Wait a moment. Let me find you an authentic item to take home and appease your wife and child. Hearing this, Morris immediately protested. No need, you don't have to go to such lengths for me. Nonetheless, Duncan had already turned and started rifling through the assortment of items next to the counter, murmuring without looking up, no more objections, we understand each other, found it. As he spoke, he retrieved the authentic item he had discovered and placed it on the counter with a resounding thud. The sudden noise startled Alice, who instinctively raised her hands to cover her head. What is this? The old man was somewhat perplexed at the object placed on the counter. An antique, Duncan stated earnestly, looking at the elderly gentleman. There aren't many genuine items in my shop, but this one is unquestionably authentic. It appears to be a cannonball. Exactly. From the vanished, in superb condition. If you locate a compatible caliber muzzle-loading cannon, you could even fire it. Duncan enthusiastically patted the large iron ball on the counter. More importantly, the projectile retains the complete steel stamp of the Cannonball Foundry and the personal mark of the caster. In truth, it's rarer than the dagger I gifted you last time. Consider it a present. Morris glanced between the cannonball and Duncan, his expression growing increasingly baffled. For a moment, he was unsure whether bringing home a cannonball or a glass pendant would be more likely to agitate his wife and daughter. However, confronted with Mr. Duncan's radiant smile, he eventually conceded and graciously accepted this gift. I am deeply grateful for your generosity. Morris departed, his expression peculiar as he held an antique artillery shell in hand while Duncan stood behind the counter and observed his departure with a delighted grin. You really gave Mr. Morris that artillery shell, Alice muttered to herself. Actually, he handed the artillery shell to Mr. Morris, Nina mumbled similarly. I'm not fond of artillery shells, Alice whispered, not in the slightest. Why? Nina inquired with curiosity. Because the captain once gifted me 8 artillery shells, Alice replied gravely. Enough with the complaints, Duncan interjected from the side. He glanced helplessly at the disgruntled Alice and the obviously fascinated Nina beside her. Where's Shirley? She mentioned feeling dizzy and nauseous from memorizing the alphabet, so she stepped outside for fresh air. Nina stuck out her tongue, but I bet she's already made her way to the next block. Figures, Duncan sighed, considering Shirley's cultural background and personal refinement. It's quite impressive that she manages not to curse in my presence every day. Sighing, he turned his head to peer out the window. Through the transparent display, the familiar and serene streetscape of Plan came into sight. The streets teemed with people, and the townsfolk were preoccupied with their daily tasks. Nothing out of the ordinary had transpired in the lower city today. The brief glitch of Vision 001, the nearly imperceptible flaw on the solar rune ring, the long-abandoned deep dive mission in the distant north, and the enigmatic symbol left by the ancient Crete kingdom, all appeared far removed from this sunlit neighborhood. He squinted for a moment, and after some time, he murmured to himself, "As I thought, Tyrion left early." Ads by PubFuture, at the city-state's southeastern port, the colossal steel warship Sea Mist was preparing to embark. The ship, which had sustained substantial damage from the Vanished, had undergone several days of self-healing, and was now more than half restored. The numerous gashes and fissures on its armor belt and deck had fully mended, leaving no trace of harm. The undying sailors bustled between the pier and the warship, loading provisions and parting gifts generously offered by Plant. "We didn't anticipate your departure so soon," Vanna said, arriving to bid the captain farewell after hearing the news. The Archbishop had arranged for the Sea Mist to remain as a guest for at least a fortnight, at Novelban at. "Truthfully, I assumed I'd be here for quite some time too, but unforeseen circumstances arose." Tyrion rubbed his forehead lightly. "There's an issue in the north that requires my attention." Though this seemed like a mere pretext, Vanna had no interest in probing into matters others preferred to keep private. She merely gazed at Tyrion with a hint of concern, her eyebrows slightly furrowed. "Please forgive my intrusion, Captain. Is your face swollen?" "Just a minor mishap, a small accident." Tyrion hastily waved his hand, grateful that he had already undergone another day of recovery. If the Inquisitor had seen him yesterday, he wouldn't have known how to justify his head, which had swelled to a significantly larger size. Subsequently, he promptly shifted the conversation to avert further awkwardness. "I've genuinely enjoyed my time in Planned and am grateful for your gifts." "I'm pleased you appreciated them," Vanna said, smiling as she glanced up at the towering hull of the Sea Mist and the main gun turrets visible from the side. "Even though I've heard about it, witnessing it firsthand is truly remarkable. This ship actually healed itself, and those main guns that were utterly destroyed have regrown." Tyrion looked back at his warship, his face beaming with pride at the newly restored guns. The Sea Mist is aware of its intended appearance and constantly strives to maintain itself in peak condition. However, those few main guns aren't quite functional at the moment. They're still small and require several more days to grow before they can fire standard caliber shells like the other main guns. Vanna was taken aback, sensing something odd about the way Tyrion observed his ship's main guns and the tone of his voice, but she couldn't pinpoint it. Luckily, she wasn't one to fixate on such minutiae. At 3:20 in the afternoon, accompanied by a melodious horn, the towering steel warship gradually accelerated and departed the city-state. Ads by PubFuture. Vanna stood on the dock, watching the warship recede into a barely discernible silhouette on the horizon, before sighing and boarding the black steam car that had been waiting nearby. The driver glanced at the visibly fatigued Inquisitor through the rearview mirror. "You seem worn out." "Handling paperwork is far more mentally taxing than battling heretics with a sword," Vanna replied, stretching her neck and casually reclining in the back seat. "Additionally, I've been struggling with insomnia lately." The steam core rumbled, and gears and linkages sprang into motion. Listening to her superior's complaints, the driver couldn't help but smile. At least the city-state has been peaceful recently. No heretics, no monsters, no unfortunate souls trapped in the night. The night guards haven't encountered any twisted sightings in the darkness for several consecutive days. There's always sunshine after a storm, right? Vanna considered her subordinate's comments, then slowly responded after some time. "True, the nights have been more tranquil lately than ever before. Even in the darkness that frequently envelops the lower city and sewers, there's no longer any commotion." "Isn't that a positive development?" "Certainly, it's a positive development," Vanna murmured softly, adjusting her position in the seat and closing her eyes. "I'll take a brief nap. Wake me when we arrive at the cathedral." "Understood." As her subordinate replied, Vanna already felt herself drifting into a light slumber, with the mechanical sounds of the car and the noise outside the window progressively fading away. She was, indeed, quite exhausted, having been unable to rest well for many days. The city-state's order had been fully restored, and all the follow-up work was systematically nearing completion. The paperwork had been handled, and there were no issues with the reports for the cathedral or the various negotiations with City Hall. Behind this smooth progress lay days of fatigue. After bidding farewell to the unique visitor, the sea mist, she could finally catch her breath. At least before the Grand Storm Cathedral arrived in planned and prior to meeting Pope Helena, she should have a few days to recuperate. Ads by PubFuture. A gentle night breeze suddenly caressed her cheek, bringing with it a cool, invigorating scent and the sound of waves colliding with a ship's hull. Vanna's eyes snapped open, and she found herself in an unfamiliar room. Her surroundings included elegant, classical furniture, intricate tapestries from the previous century adorning the walls, dark-hued shelves and wine cabinets tucked in the corners, a thick woven carpet occupying the room's center, and a carved coffee table and chairs atop the carpet. At that moment, she was seated in one of those chairs. Vanna abruptly stood, assuming a defensive posture like a cautious animal, ready for anything around her. The next instant, she spotted a window nearby. The window was wide open, and though it had been daylight when she dozed off, the scene beyond the opening was now enveloped in darkness. A chilly night wind blew into the room through the window, casting a cold, luminous glow over the windowsill. Within the glow, she could faintly discern the rolling sea in the distance and the glimmers of light upon the water that resembled liquid silver. Vanna's gaze was involuntarily drawn to this scene, and then, as if she had made a sudden realization, she rushed to the window and peered up at the sky outside. An incomprehensible entity appeared there. It was a glowing, circular object reminiscent of the sun's core, yet it was neither blinding nor searing. Instead, it resembled a radiant disk with a cool sensation, silently hovering in the sky while exuding a tranquil and serene aura. Vanna gazed blankly at the peculiar light, and for a moment, she felt as though her thoughts had been lulled into a serene state by the radiance. After an indeterminate amount of time, she pondered sluggishly. What is that? Could it be the cooled sun? Where did the fissure in the night sky vanish to? Where is this place? Then she glanced back at the unfamiliar room. The exterior was a rolling sea, the room was strange, the sky beyond the window was eerie, and the bizarre celestial body, given her recent experiences, the answer didn't seem difficult to deduce. But this occasion appeared different from the others. This time, she didn't encounter that horrifying ghost captain. Vanna thought as much, but as if to contradict her thoughts, the next moment, she suddenly sensed a presence drawing near. Knock, knock, knock. Someone rapped on the door. To be fair, Vanna had rarely been afraid of anything throughout her life, but Captain Duncan Abnomar always seemed to bring her a variety of unexpected situations. In the dream-locked room, there was a boundless dark sea outside the window, an eerie light hovering high in the sky, and beneath the quiet night, someone knocked on the door. Almost instinctively, Vanna wanted to summon her broadsword in her dream and charge toward the door. Luckily, she managed to control this impulse just in time. Knock, knock, knock. The knocking continued at a leisurely pace, with great patience and politeness. Taking several deep breaths, Vanna wasn't sure what expression to wear, so she could only try to make her voice sound normal while keeping a straight face. Come in. With a click, the handle turned, and the dark wooden door was pushed open from the outside. A tall and imposing figure appeared before Vanna and stepped into the room. Behind this figure lay pure darkness as if it were the edge of the dream. Beyond the edge, there was no existence, only the void. Good afternoon, Vanna. This time, I knocked. Duncan entered the room, giving Vanna a friendly smile. Vanna silently watched the ghostly captain walk to the nearby liquor cabinet, taking out a bottle and 2 wine glasses before taking a seat on the chair with the backrest. Why don't you come sit? Duncan raised his eyebrows and glanced at the young inquisitor still standing near the window, gesturing to the empty seat across from him. You don't look too happy. After hesitating for a moment, Vanna finally sat down across from Duncan with a peculiar expression, cautiously observing his every move as he poured the drinks. After a while, she sighed. Don't you think this is even scarier? Is it? Duncan looked at Vanna with some surprise, then glanced around the dream he had painstakingly created, the cozy, everyday decor, and the friendly glass of wine in his hand, and furrowed his brow uncertainly. Then next time, I'll try a brighter color scheme. Ads by PubFuture. I don't think it's the color. Vanna's eyebrows twitched, but she sighed with mixed emotions immediately after. Well, at least I do feel your good intentions. They're somewhat scary, but I can more or less confirm their authenticity. Duncan pushed a glass of wine toward her. Seems like a good thing. Thank you. Vanna took the glass, hesitated as she looked at the clear liquid with a hint of golden red, and after a long pause, she set it aside. Then she looked up at the captain across from her. Is this another dream, a room on the vanished? It's partly based on that, but not entirely. I've arranged it according to my personal preferences, Duncan said unhurriedly. Actually, I'm not very good at weaving dreams. I prefer entering existing dreams directly, but since you were sleeping restlessly, with shattered and chaotic dreams, I prepared a place for you to rest properly. Vanna didn't pay attention to Duncan's last sentence. She simply turned her head to look outside the window and asked her biggest question, what is that glowing thing in the sky outside? Is it also your personal preference? Duncan fell silent for a moment, his gaze shifting to the window. Illuminated by the moonlight, he pondered for a while before sighing and shaking his head. I suppose so. I don't really like the pale, cold glow of the world's creation. It's not gentle enough, and it feels full of malice. As for the one you see now, you can call it the moon. Moon? Vanna repeated the unfamiliar word, which seemed to be a direct transliteration from an unknown language. It's a peculiar name. Are you interested in it? Duncan asked with a smile. I can tell you the story behind the name. Before he could finish, Vanna suddenly interrupted. No. Thank you. All right, it's always like this, Duncan shrugged, not seeming to care. It's actually just the most ordinary thing, with no connection to subspace at all. I'm sorry, I believe you're friendly, but, just consider me cautious, Vanna said awkwardly. After numerous encounters and a series of events, her caution and wariness towards the ghostly captain had somewhat evolved, but in any case, even from a logical and rational perspective, she didn't dare to casually learn knowledge from this subspace returnee. Let's talk about something else. Why did you come to see me? Two things. Duncan looked into Vanna's eyes. First, thank you for taking care of Tyrion these past couple of days. He seems to have enjoyed his time in Plant. Captain Tyrion. Vanna felt a jolt in her heart, suddenly realizing something. Have you been watching all this time? Yes, I've been keeping an eye on this matter, Duncan said with emotion. He's been wandering in the north for years, picking up some bad habits from the pirates, and only has a group of undead sailors for company, making his social habits extremely unhealthy. Add to that the old matter of Frost, it's hard not to worry about his mental state. To avoid becoming a reclusive, eccentric, and cynical weirdo, he needs some healthy and orderly interpersonal relationships. Ads by PubFuture. Duncan was essentially improvising to further solidify his image as someone who had regained his humanity and clear-headedness, to facilitate his dealings with Vanna and the orderly civilization she represented. However, Vanna didn't dismiss it as nonsense. She listened intently to the ghostly captain, who sounded like a concerned father, and after a while, she managed to say, "You really care about him?" Duncan said solemnly, caring for family members is the first step in maintaining harmony within the family. But you almost blew the sea mist into a pile of scrap metal, Vanna cautiously reminded him. Duncan remained serious. Appropriate education and guidance is the second step. Vanna. The conversation was strange, discordant, and full of peculiarities. Vanna increasingly felt that her interaction with Captain Duncan was imbued with an indescribable sense of oddness. Yet, inexplicably, it was within this bizarre and incongruous exchange that she actually began to see the ghostly captain as more human nobleman at. She couldn't help but shake her head, setting that sudden thought aside for now. What's the second thing you mentioned? The second thing, Duncan's expression immediately became more serious, is about the sun. Have you noticed the changes in it? The sound of waves outside the window gradually softened as if they were distant whispers, and the breeze that drifted into the room became barely perceptible. Upon hearing the mention of the sun, Vanna's eyes shifted slightly. Are you referring to the sunrise that was delayed by 15 minutes, or? There is a gap in its external rune ring, Duncan said. Judging by your expression, you should have noticed it as well. Vanna fell silent for a couple of seconds before nodding gently. It's hard not to notice. Although the gap is difficult to detect with the naked eye, vigilant eyes have been watching the operation of Vision 001 for centuries. The church noticed this unsettling situation right away. Guardians never let their guard down. My impression of you has improved slightly, Duncan said, then suddenly asked, so what's your take on this? Ads by PubFuture. That would depend on the feedback from the Grand Storm Cathedral, Vanna said in a matter-of-fact tone. All we can do in planned is report what we've observed. We are not a research facility, and we can't think of any way to intervene in the operation of Vision 001. After pondering for a moment, she shook her head uncertainly. Perhaps even the Grand Storm Cathedral won't provide clear feedback. Vision 001, its operation affects the entire world, and its abnormalities have alarmed more than just one church. As she spoke, Vanna seemed to suddenly realize something and looked up at Duncan. You've come to talk to me about this. Do you know something? Do you know what's wrong with Vision 001? Duncan didn't answer immediately. He couldn't help but recall the brief, strange dream he'd had. In the dream, massive light bodies fell like a meteor shower, and the entire world gradually turned dark. In the end, all that remained in the sky was a horrifying, dark emptiness, like a void or a dying eye. At the time, he hadn't gleaned anything from this dream, but now, he seemed to get a glimpse into the omen hidden within it. I can't be sure, Vanna, he finally broke the silence, calmly staring into her eyes, but I think this is just the beginning. A chill spread slowly down her spine as Vanna discerned some extremely unsettling information from those words, just the beginning. Right now, I don't have enough evidence, but my guess is that Vision 001 actually has a lifespan, Duncan said seriously. What the ancient kingdom of Crete left for future generations is not eternal protection but temporary peace. The sun above our heads is likely about to fail. As for when the evidence will arrive, Duncan paused, then continued. Perhaps huge fragments will fall from the sky, and that will be the ticking of the countdown. More likely, the first fragment has already fallen, just out of sight of the civilized world. As the chill and unease spread in her heart, Vanna's eyes drooped, hiding all the changes in her gaze, while her hand slowly picked up the wine glass beside her, unconsciously bringing it to her lips, seemingly trying to calm herself with alcohol. She took a sip, frowned slightly, and looked up at Duncan. It has no taste. Of course there's no taste. Duncan laughed and raised his glass slightly to Vanna, because you're about to wake up. Vanna abruptly opened her eyes, finding herself still sitting in the moving steam car with the high tower and main building of the cathedral appearing in her view. Breathing a bit heavily, she heard a subordinate's voice from the front. You're awake. Perfect timing, we're nearly at the cathedral. Lucretia stood at the prow of her ship for some time, overseeing the operations of her vessel in its blossomed state as they navigated through the luminous waters. This location provided her with an unrivaled view of the entire ship, making it her preferred spot. At the moment, two sturdy chains extended from the bright star's midsection, winding around a massive stone sphere at the rear. At first glance, the sphere seemed to hover just a few meters above the ocean, appearing weightless from a distance. However, the intermittent creaking of the chains and the slow progress of the bright star, despite operating at full capacity, suggested that towing this object was far from effortless. Lucretia observed the sphere for an indeterminate amount of time before eventually averting her eyes, rubbing them due to irritation. The endless soft glow emanating from the stone sphere was not blinding, but prolonged exposure to this continuous radiance caused minor eye discomfort. Still, this was insignificant compared to the disorientation created by the enigmatic indentations and protrusions on the sphere's surface. Moreover, she could not detect any other harmful effects from the sphere. Gazing at the patterns did not damage the mind, nor did it produce any unsettling noises when approached. Discovering such an unusual artifact on the border was quite uncommon. Having explored the borders for many years, Lucretia had encountered numerous dangerous objects that could easily drive ordinary people mad. However, this stone sphere, which projected immense geometric illusions, was the most harmless anomaly among the various border relics. Mistress, the engine room reports that we cannot increase the machine's power any further. We've reached our top speed. Luna eventually approached from the side and reported, at Nobleman at. We're not even achieving a third of our usual speed, Lucretia sighed. This massive sphere appears so light and insubstantial, yet it's so challenging to tow. It's truly peculiar. Looney tilted her head, mimicking a human's puzzled expression. We've attempted various methods, but we're unable to determine its precise mass. Fortunately, we can still tow it. The progress is slow, but we'll reach our destination eventually. As Lucretia spoke, she turned her gaze toward the ship's bow. Due to the limited length of the chains, the bright star now sailed within the massive geometric figure projected by the stone sphere. As a result, beyond the bow was only infinite radiance, rendering the normal sea surface invisible. However, she wasn't concerned about the ship getting lost or colliding with islands or reefs. That's because the stern of the bright star traveled in the spiritual realm, unaffected by the stone sphere. Her spectral sailors could monitor sea conditions and direct the course from the lookout tower and chart room at the stern, ensuring the bright star remained on the correct path. Adds by PubFuture. For ordinary vessels, this would be unfathomable, but for the mistress of the bright star, it was a masterful maneuver. Did Wind Harbor receive our message? Lucretia inquired, turning slightly. What was their response? They received the message, and a research team comprising of mathematicians, rune scholars, and supernatural experts is prepared at the port, along with representatives from the Explorers Association, Looney answered promptly. However, I also informed them that the bright star is sailing very slowly, so they'll have to wait a bit longer. It's not just about waiting, Lucretia said, observing the omnipresent golden glow on the sea and pursing her lips. Tell them that what I've discovered this time is no mere trinket. Although its main body is indeed not large, its area of influence is extensive. Ask them to locate an appropriate transfer point along the coast, at least 2 or 3 nautical miles from the port, otherwise, they must be ready for the entire port area to be engulfed in perpetual daylight. Looney bowed slightly. Yes, mistress, we'll pass a lighthouse facility in 15 minutes, and I'll send another telegram to Wind Harbor then. Lucretia nodded, then appeared to recall something and shook her head with a self-deprecating smile after a few moments of silence. Looney looked at her with curiosity. Mistress. It's nothing. I just suddenly remembered something from long ago, Lucretia said softly. Looney, did you know that I used to scold my father when he returned from his adventures? Old master, you scolded him. Yes, I scolded him for always collecting peculiar items from his journeys. Lucretia seemed immersed in memories, speaking slowly as she pondered. Sometimes, he would find a broken stone in the border area and excitedly study it for a week or a month, even involving my brother and me in the research. She turned around, staring pensively at the chains extending from the stern and the stone sphere at their end. Now, I've also picked up a large stone. I wonder what he would think if he knew. Looney didn't know how to respond to her mistress, and after a moment of silence, she finally said, You rarely discuss the old master's matters. Adds by PubFuture. It's probably because of recent events. Lucretia shook her head. Let's not dwell on that. I'm somewhat tired. What time is it now? It's already quite late, Looney nodded. You should indeed get some rest. Is it really late already? Lucretia exclaimed, surprised, then waved her hand. Dragging this object along makes the entire day feel like daylight. Keep an eye on the ship, I'm going to rest. Before her words were finished, her figure suddenly disintegrated into countless colorful paper flakes carried by the wind toward the captain's quarters. Until she returned to the cathedral and evening prayers were concluded, Vanna remained preoccupied, and her heavy-hearted state couldn't be concealed from Bishop Valentine. When the bishop inquired, she didn't hide her dream communication with the ghost captain during her journey back from the port. In a small prayer room connected to the side hall, Valentine listened quietly to Vanna's account. I'm not surprised by his visit, the elderly bishop said calmly. The entire city-state of Planned has experienced some kind of transformation. Whether we like it or not, we and the land beneath our feet are now inseparably connected to the vanished. I've discussed this matter with your uncle. Do you know what he said? What did he say? Behind today's plan stands a shadowy master, reminiscent of the 10 cities described in the Golan Psalms. In the shadows, there's a crownless king, an unnamed archon, an invisible but very real owner. This master hasn't declared authority over the city-state, just as you haven't declared to the coins in your pocket that you're their master, but when you take out the coins, you don't consider consulting their opinions. Vanna appeared thoughtful. The 10 cities, said to be the most chilling part of the Golan Psalms, depict the process of 10 city-states gradually being taken over and transformed into shadows by an unseen ruler. Until the end of the lengthy poem, the author never described the ruler himself, merely hinting at the existence of an invisible king, through descriptions of the atmosphere, customs, and environment in the city-states. I've read it, but I was too young at the time to understand the horror that adults spoke of when discussing this poem. With that, she gently shook her head. However, at least Captain Duncan doesn't seem to be trying to transform the city-state into some sort of indescribable breeding ground, as the 10 cities poem suggests. At least for now, he hasn't shown any malice. Indeed, he hasn't shown any malice and even went out of his way to warn you. Bishop Valentine nodded gently. The matter of Vision 001 has attracted the attention of the 4 churches, but as far as I know, the prevailing opinion among the various churches is still to wait for Vision 001 to return to normal. But if Captain Duncan's warning is true... The old bishop paused, and after a moment, he sighed softly. Then the trouble facing our world will be much greater. Vanna rose and approached the goddess's statue in the intimate prayer room. The figure was positioned on a tall platform, surrounded by gently flickering candles. We must relay this warning to the Grand Storm Cathedral, and ideally to other churches and city-states, Bishop Valentine remarked from behind her. However, the origin of the warning is crucial. To be convincing, we must provide a reason that will sway the other 3 churches. Simply saying, a saint had a revelation in a dream, will not suffice. Her Holiness knows of your association with Captain Duncan and has not issued any admonishments. It appears she tacitly approves, but if the other churches learned the truth, their response would be unpredictable, particularly the Death Church. The impact of the Witherland 13 Islands, Vanna murmured softly. The Death Church is exceptionally vigilant when it comes to the vanished. Indeed, the Witherland 13 Islands, once the largest archipelago city-state under the Death Church's control, were pulled into subspace by the vanished a century ago. For followers of the God of Death, those islands hold a significance comparable to planned for the Storm Church today, Valentine sighed. It's troublesome. After 100 years, it's not just about resentment, but also the innate human distrust toward an uncontrollable catastrophe. If they discovered the source of this warning, they might suspect a conspiracy. Vanna remained silent for a moment before suddenly suggesting, the Grand Storm Cathedral is convening soon. Perhaps Her Holiness will have her own thoughts. Let's hope, Valentine muttered, lacking confidence. Regardless, the 4 churches have already taken note of Vision 01's situation. It seems our level of concern has been inadequate. If the Storm Church could take the initiative and elevate the importance of this matter, it would at least achieve the intended effect of this warning. Vanna nodded slowly, gazing up at the statue of Storm Goddess Gomona, and whispered a prayer, "May you protect us." At the stern deck of the Vanished, Duncan had just finished a full ship patrol and was preparing to retire to his quarters. Periodically, the Vanished required a thorough inspection, particularly its submerged chambers, which demanded the captain's presence to maintain stability. During this examination, Duncan also verified the subspace door at the ship's bottom, ensuring it remained securely closed. This brought him some relief. Adds by PubFuture. However, along with that relief came lingering uneasiness. He still couldn't understand how he had managed to cross to the other side of the door after falling asleep in his room the last time. He had entered subspace in a stupor and spent half a day aboard another Vanished. Although he had ultimately found a way back safely, he could never be fully at ease without knowing the mechanism for entering subspace. Moreover, his entry into subspace occurred just after Vision 001 experienced issues. Issues with the sun, peculiar dreams, and entering subspace. These 3 events occurred in such close succession that it's difficult not to suspect a hidden link between them. Duncan stood before the captain's cabin, clutching a lantern in one hand, inhaling the cold night air deeply. This sense of unease may have prompted him to issue a warning during his prior dream communication with Vanna. Although he was uncertain how much his strange dreams mirrored reality, his numerous encounters with supernatural phenomena taught him one thing. Ordinary people might dismiss dreams, but for him, Captain Duncan, having a dream should not be taken lightly. Now he hoped his warning would bring the four churches attention to the matter of Vision 001. He was aware that he wasn't an expert in the supernatural realm, and even if he wished to investigate the Vision 001 issue, he wouldn't know where to begin. His role was to draw the attention of genuine experts to the problem. A warning from Captain Duncan would undoubtedly provide a compelling reason for many to take it seriously. Gathering his thoughts, Duncan placed his hand on the doorknob of his cabin. Before opening the door, however, another thought crossed his mind. The abyss plan that Tyrion had mentioned to him. Duncan furrowed his brow, pondered for a moment, and then pushed open the door of the lost directly. A whirl of fog emerged from the doorframe as he stepped through it. Ads by PubFuture. After brief dizziness and a sensation of spatial displacement, Zhou Ming opened his eyes to find the familiar bachelor apartment, where everything remained as it was. He steadied himself, checking the windowsill, desk, and other areas to ensure that everything here was unchanged. Then he walked to the end of the room. On the modest shelf, the intricate models of the vanished and planned still sat quietly in their original positions. Zhou Ming approached, picked up the model, symbolizing planned, and held the neither light nor heavy collection in his hand as he sat at the nearby desk to scrutinize its base structure. Previously, he had never considered this issue. He had to admit that, beneath the city-state, was not only a blind spot for many people in this world but also for himself. He observed an extremely smooth bottom surface. The portion of the model corresponding to the sea level below the planned city-state ended abruptly, leaving a smooth surface as if it had been sliced by a sharp blade. Zhou Ming stared at the base of the model, deep in thought, at it nobleman at. If it were merely a model, this neat and even bottom surface would, of course, be perfectly normal. However, he knew that this collection was no ordinary model. It should be the mapping, or projection, of the actual planned in this room. What this object depicted should be the complete appearance of planned. Regardless of what was beneath the city-state, an infinitely long pillar or thin base, there should be a structure, not the abrupt ending of the portion below the sea level as it appeared now. Was it because he hadn't been thorough enough when he set the city-state ablaze? Or because he had overlooked this part? Zhou Ming furrowed his brow slightly, his fingers tapping the edge of the desk absent-mindedly. He then composed himself, placed his hand over the model, and allowed his spirit to gradually expand. Within planned city-state, in the antique shop, Duncan had just bid goodnight to Nina and Shirley. He silently returned to his room, approached the window, and gazed quietly at the tranquil nighttime streets illuminated by lamps. The night was deep, and nearly all the city-state's residents had gone home. The streets and alleys were incredibly quiet, with only a few points of light moving in the dim depths of the alleys. Those were the night patrol guards and the lanterns they carried. Ads by PubFuture. Duncan closed his eyes slightly. The entire planned city-state's landscape was directly projected into his mind with a clearer and more intuitive perspective. Crowded residential areas, bustling steam factories, peaceful commercial districts, damp coastal streets, roadside gas lamps, and the city-spanning pipeline system. Somewhere in the city, a squad of guards exited an alley, preparing to inspect the next gas and steam node. A young team member, holding a lantern, looked at the quiet street ahead and muttered admiringly, "It seems to be another peaceful night. To be honest, I'm not used to these quiet nights." "Don't let your guard down." The squad leader glanced at his subordinate. "Anything can happen in the darkness. Keep an eye on the darkest corners." "Yes, I understand." The team member straightened up but couldn't resist adding, "But don't you think it's been really quiet these past few days? I heard that there hasn't been a single incident in the city's recent night patrol records." A faint green glow suddenly flashed at the edge of their vision, causing the team member to stop involuntarily. It seemed that the light emitted from the distant gas lamp had momentarily changed, but it was extremely brief and elusive, almost impossible to detect. "Did you just see something flash by?" The team member instinctively pressed his hand to the rune steel sword at his waist and spoke softly. It looked like the gas lamp flickered. "I saw your lantern flicker too," another team member chimed in. The team members instinctively turned their gaze to the squad leader. However, the squad leader only furrowed his brow, seemingly deep in thought. After several seconds, the experienced guard shook his head. "Continue the patrol, report the situation to the church afterward." Similar incidents occurred throughout the city as the guard squad departed, with the green light shadows overtaking the usual flames tonight. In that transcendent and clear perception, Duncan allowed his consciousness to descend bit by bit, investigating the city-state's structure below sea level. Back in the apartment room, Zhou Ming abruptly opened his eyes when he heard a faint friction sound. He picked up the collection in front of him and stared intently at the bottom of the planned city-state. A rough and intricate new structure was slowly forming at the base of this model. The base of the model was growing. As Zhou Ming Duncan's thoughts spread, the structure representing the underground world of the planned city-state gradually took shape in his mind. The sections that appeared in his cognition were transformed into corresponding new parts on this collection. It was rough, resembling a rocky disk, growing at a visible rate and encompassing the entire underground portion of the planned city-state. Gradually, it began to reveal more bizarre and intricate details, layers of sediment from thousands of years, tiny spike-like growths, and strange protrusions winding between the layers. It looked like the coarse skin of an echinoderm or the grotesque outer layer left by a rock corroded in strong acid. Finally, the growth process ceased. The bottom of the model, representing the planned city-state, now included an additional disc-like base. However, what came next caused Zhou Ming to frown. He could sense that his consciousness spreading within the planned city-state didn't stop. Instead, it continued to extend downward. In darkness and cold, beyond the reach of normal senses, he felt his spirit seep and flow downward like mercury sinking into the soil. He distinctly felt his gaze passing through thick concrete, soil, and rocks, through an extremely dense but non-metallic, non-stone shell, sinking into the icy seawater and continuing downward, ever downward. How much further did it extend? 100 meters? 200 meters? Zhou Ming couldn't be certain. All he knew was that his perception continued to spread downward, even though he was already beyond the boundaries of the planned city-state, and no new structures appeared on the collection in his hand. His thoughts still flowed along an invisible medium. His initial reaction was anxiety, and he subconsciously wanted to control this thought of falling into the deep sea. However, the continuous fall suddenly halted before he could react. It was as if he had abruptly hit an invisible limit, or reached the end of the medium. His perception finally settled at a certain depth in the deep water below the city-state and stabilized there. Zhou Ming felt his heart pounding, experiencing the ups and downs of a sudden fall, only to be abruptly halted by a rope halfway down. It took him nearly half a minute to calm down and regain control of his breathing and heartbeat. After steadying his mind, he slowly picked up the planned model in front of him, observing the thick rock stratum extending from its base. The rough and grotesque structure was overall quite orderly. The bottom was a jagged fracture surface, giving the impression that it had been forcibly broken off from somewhere or that it had been disturbed during the generational process from top to bottom, resulting in an ugly fracture. As for the structure inside the disk, it was utterly chaotic, difficult to perceive, and impossible to probe. Zhou Ming's attention was not drawn to the disc-shaped base. Instead, he focused on the space beneath it. Ads by PubFuture. A part of his consciousness extended and hovered in that position. Zhou Ming gently closed his eyes again and was hit with an intensified perception. He felt as though he was submerged in the dark, frigid depths of the ocean, with immeasurable seawater surrounding and compressing him layer by layer. The sensation of pressure was so vivid that it seemed as though even his consciousness was constrained and confined. He attempted to open his eyes in the darkness but only saw an infinite void. Gradually, however, it appeared that tiny specks of light emerged within the emptiness. Could they be deep-sea plankton, bioluminescent fish, or something else entirely? Zhou Ming endeavored to identify them for a while before realizing it was the base of plant. He was looking up, at planned and observed the underside of the rough disc-shaped base adorned with minuscule, glowing structures amid the profound darkness. Yet, he couldn't decipher what it was. His pure conscious perception, separated by such an immense distance and dense seawater, delivered information that was simply too indistinct. Then, Zhou Ming gradually adapted, attempting to shift his focus to another direction, deeper into the ocean floor. All he felt was an infinite void and darkness. In the deep sea, there seemed to be nothing. But after some time, he suddenly sensed something indistinct. Something immensely vast, lifeless, and possibly as large as planned itself, lay dormant within that boundless darkness. Zhou Ming couldn't see or hear it. The extreme darkness and silence concealed every aspect of that massive entity, but he was certain that something was there, quiet and hidden, as though it had existed since the dawn of time. After an indeterminate period, Zhou Ming returned, having failed to achieve his goal. Ultimately, he couldn't see what lay in the deep sea directly beneath planned. However, he had a suspicion. The enormous structure concealed right below the city-state likely motivated Queen Rhaenora of the Frostbite Kingdom to initiate the Abyss plan half a century earlier. Ads by PubFuture. It was beneath Frost, planned, and probably other city-states too. Zhou Ming inhaled deeply, stood up, picked up the planned city-state model, and slowly walked to the shelf at the room's far end. The model now had an additional base, but it could still fit into the storage slot on the shelf. As if from the outset, the model and slot had allowed for ample space. But before inserting the model, Zhou Ming's gaze fell once more on the space below the base, and a trace of uncertainty arose in his mind. His consciousness could spread within the city-state, but in the deep sea, it had clearly surpassed the physical limits of this city-state model. Its bottom structure ended abruptly at 850 meters, yet beyond that, his consciousness had extended another 1 to 200 meters downward. How did it stretch that extra 1 to 200 meters? What was that unseen medium? Zhou Ming slowly returned the model to the shelf with more questions than answers. As usual, the sun once again ascended into the sky. In Plan's lower district, in the small open area in front of the antique shop, Duncan observed Nina joyfully riding her bicycle in circles, then up and down the street, before coming to a steady halt in front of him. "Uncle, I've become really skilled at Novelban at." Nina had one foot on the ground, her face beaming with excitement and pride. Duncan's face revealed a faint smile. "Not bad, you're indeed riding quite adeptly, but your bike is resting on my foot." Nina glanced down quickly and hastily moved the wheel away. "Ah. Sorry. It's all right." Duncan smiled and waved his hand, then took a deep breath and looked up at the sunlit street. The city-state remained the same. Beneath the sunlit streets, the deep darkness and immense shadows felt like elements from another realm, not impacting people's daily lives in the slightest. However, since completing his exploration of plans, underneath, he couldn't help but think about the cold, dark depths of the ocean and the enormous structure he had sensed there. It caused him to lose focus occasionally. Ads by PubFuture. He even wondered if the Frost Queen from 50 years prior had experienced similar feelings. Had she also caught a glimpse of the deep-sea secrets through some means, or perhaps discovered even more than he had? "Uncle, you're daydreaming again." Nina's voice suddenly intruded, interrupting Duncan's wild thoughts. "Are you okay? You've been daydreaming since this morning." "I'm fine." Duncan quickly waved his hand and then looked toward the end of the street as though trying to change the subject. "But on that note, Alice hasn't returned yet." "She hasn't been gone for very long," Nina casually remarked, "and you don't need to worry so much. She's just purchasing a newspaper. It's not like she's traversing half the city. She shouldn't get lost, right?" "I really can't be certain." Duncan sighed. This is her first time venturing out alone in the true sense, even if it's just to the newsstand on the corner. "I think it's okay." Nina pondered for a moment and confidently stated, "I rehearsed with her multiple times before she left, including how to communicate what she wants to buy, how to give change, and expressing gratitude after receiving the item. She's learned it all." "Ah, hopefully," Duncan sighed. "It's just that when she initially started in the ship's kitchen, even fetching a plate would result in a collision with a frying pan." Nina stared blankly. "I don't think these two situations can be compared." While they conversed, Alice's figure came into view. The doll-like girl clutched a newspaper in her arms, her face displaying a bright smile as she ran toward them with her head held high, calling out while running, "Mr. Duncan, I got the newspaper." Nina chuckled. "See, I told you Miss Alice would be all right." On the other hand, Duncan was alarmed by Alice's running action and immediately rushed forward to intercept her, yelling loudly, "Don't run. Slow down." As if to confirm their concerns, while they spoke, he watched in disbelief as Alice stumbled and fell headfirst less than 5 meters in front of him, crashing to the ground. However, in the next instant, the doll-like girl rose as if nothing had occurred, dusted off her skirt, picked up the newspaper that had fallen to the ground, and approached Duncan with a grin. "Newspaper." Rather than immediately accepting the newspaper, Duncan gazed at the unscathed doll girl with a disbelieving expression. After a moment, he managed to ask, "How did your head not fall off after a tumble like that?" Alice maintained her confident stance, neck held high and face adorned with a bright smile. "I discovered an excellent method to reinforce it." Duncan examined the doll skeptically. "An excellent method?" "Alice. I used glue." Duncan, taken aback for a few seconds, he couldn't help but inquire, "Who taught you that?" "Surely." Observing Alice with her seemingly confident posture, her neck held high, Duncan's mood abruptly shifted to confusion. He quickly realized that her awkward stance was not due to confidence or pride, but rather, she had become completely stiff and unable to move. Miss Doll, however, appeared oblivious to the gravity of the situation and maintained a smug expression. Giggling, she handed the newspaper to Duncan, obviously pleased with herself for managing to shop alone. "Here's your newspaper, and I even remembered to get the change." Duncan accepted the newspaper without expression, and after a brief pause, reminded the awkward girl, "Alice, try nodding your head." "Huh, why?" Alice was caught off guard but promptly chose to obey the captain's order. Consequently, her head barely moved, accompanied by a peculiar noise from her neck, leaving her immobilized. Following a moment of bewilderment, the doll finally reacted, exclaiming, "Mr. Duncan, I can't move. Please help me, help me." Duncan, both mentally and physically drained, glanced at the doll and headed towards the antique shop. "Stop yelling outside, we'll figure it out indoors." Alice quickly trailed behind Duncan, joined by a perplexed and helpless Nina. The trio entered the antique shop, where Nina carefully closed the door and hung a, temporarily closed, wooden sign. Duncan set the newly purchased newspaper on the counter, intending to assess Alice's situation, when the front page caught his eye and instantly drew his attention. The headline, printed in bold, black letters, read, "The Grand Storm Cathedral will arrive at planned in the hour of noon tomorrow. The glory of the Storm Lord will protect us all." The Grand Storm Cathedral, the mysterious storm, headquarter at sea. The envoy of the storm goddess Gomona is coming to this city, for the prior historical pollution event. Or for the vanished, or both. Duncan frowned, picked up the newspaper, and quickly scanned the front page article. In a state of panic, Alice sought Nina's help upon realizing that the captain was preoccupied. "Miss Nina, please help me, save me, save me." Nina, too, was somewhat rattled. She grabbed Alice's head and shook it side to side, discovering that the glue had entirely hardened. This can't be removed. It's clearly a fast-drying glue." Ads by PubFuture. "Find a solution," Alice pleaded, on the verge of tears, clutching her head with both hands. "Miss Nina, you study mechanical repair and such, right? You can fix complex steam cores, so fix me. I don't know how to repair dolls either." Nina was equally frantic, ultimately turning to Duncan for assistance. "Uncle, please think of something. Miss Alice's head is totally glued." Duncan finally set the newspaper aside, glanced at the two distressed girls beside him, and directed his attention to Alice. "How much glue did you use, and what type of glue was it?" Holding her hand up, Alice indicated the size. "I found one bottle about this big in your room, a small brown glass bottle. You poured the entire thing in." Duncan's eye twitched noticeably. "How did you manage to do that?" "I just removed my head, turned it upside down, poured the glue in, shook it slightly, and then put it back on," Alice said, her voice trembling as if she was about to cry. "Shirley told me it would be secure that way." Duncan stared at her, dumbfounded. He could sense the beautiful doll's despair, but as a doll, she had no tears to shed. All her sadness could only flow through her hollow heart. It would have sounded poetic if the detail, the doll's despair was caused by her head getting glued, were disregarded. Duncan sighed, set the newspaper aside, walked over, and untied the lace decoration around Alice's neck. He examined the hardened super glue around the edges of her joint and, after a moment of silence, turned to Nina. "Where is Shirley?" "She said her head hurt from memorizing words an hour ago, so she went out to get some fresh air," Nina replied, shrinking her neck. "Did she run away because she felt guilty?" "I doubt she thought that far. The only thing on her mind these days is skipping class." Duncan sighed and shook his head. "No, it's completely dried. It's fast-drying glue, so brute force won't work." "What should I do?" Alice looked helplessly at Duncan. I need to take my head off when I comb my hair. I can't comb it with my head on." "Is that your only concern after your head got glued?" Duncan glared at Alice, then waved his hand wearily. "All right, don't look so miserable. This glue is strong, but it's not heat or water resistant. Soak it in hot water, and it'll come off in no time." Alice immediately looked relieved, and Nina, who had been worried beside her, quickly reacted, rushing over to hold Alice's hand. "I'll take you to the bathroom. I can heat water very quickly now." Ads by PubFuture. The sun fragment that was Nina led the glued-headed doll upstairs, leaving Duncan to sigh in the rear and focus back on the newspaper at hand. According to public information, the Grand Storm Cathedral's docking in Planned was merely a routine maintenance stop. Hope Helena would briefly visit Planned's local cathedral during this time and discuss church matters with the Archbishop and Inquisitor. The newspaper made no mention of the previous historical pollution incident or any connection to the vanished. But even if the newspaper didn't mention it, it was clear to anyone with eyes that the Storm Pope was here for those two significant events, at Novelban at. Duncan wasn't concerned about the faith of the Storm Goddess, but he couldn't help but wonder what impact this event would have on him. Or, could he seize this opportunity to gather some intelligence? He still remembered the message, "Thank you," that was supposedly from the Storm Goddess, and even without that event, he was curious about the deities of this world. He was also interested in the Grand Storm Cathedral, which was said to have been sailing the boundless sea all year round. On the other hand, he was also curious whether the highest representative of the Storm Goddess, upon her arrival, would notice any abnormalities in the planned city-state or discover his hidden, subspace shadow, within the island. Things were getting interesting. Duncan set down the newspaper, sat at the counter, and thoughtfully stroked his chin. The antique shop was very quiet, with the faint sounds of Nina and Alice in the upstairs bathroom. The clearest sound was Nina's exclamations of surprise. "Wow, these joints are truly amazing, and so beautiful. Miss Alice, can your wrist really rotate 360 degrees? It really can. Miss Alice, there's a keyhole on your back, huh? You don't know what it's for either." Ads by PubFuture. "Is it okay if the keyhole gets wet?" "Oh, then I'm relieved." Duncan rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. He began to suspect that the two upstairs had completely forgotten about their task. However, soon the voices upstairs quieted down, followed by hurried footsteps running to the stairway entrance, and Nina's voice called out, "Uncle Duncan. It's not working. You come and take a look, we can't get it off at all." Duncan. He went upstairs, puzzled, and saw Nina standing helplessly in the hallway. He looked up to see Alice peering out from the bathroom at the end of the hallway, appearing embarrassed. The doll lady then emerged, soaked from head to toe, wrapped in a towel, her head still firmly attached. "Captain, it still won't come off," Alice said with a mournful face. "It hasn't loosened at all," Nina mumbled quietly. "We tried hot water for a long time." Duncan looked at Alice, then at Nina, who was clutching the corner of her clothes, and finally sighed after a long pause. "Use boiling water." "Huh?" Nina was taken aback. Really? Can Miss Alice handle it? She once deep-fried her own head. She's not afraid of this temperature at all." Duncan spread his hands. "It seems that using hot water won't work now. There's still hope with boiling water." Nina's eyes seemed a little dazed. She thought hard about the process and hesitantly said, "It's easy to get boiling water. I can do that quickly, but we don't have a pot big enough for that." nor a bathtub that can fit her whole body. If we want to soak her head in the water, Miss Alice will have to crouch down in the water, right? As she spoke and gestured, even though she was academically excellent at school, Nina still felt her imagination was struggling to keep up with reality. But Duncan didn't have the same limitations in his thinking as Nina. He just looked at the pitiful Gothic doll wrapped in a towel nearby and turned to Nina, saying, "That's easy. Just find a big pot, and let her dive in headfirst. I can even hold her on the side." Nina imagined the scene and had a picture in her mind, but her tone became even more hesitant. "I feel like it's a bit pitiful for Miss Alice." "Pitiful my ass." Duncan finally lost his patience and swore unprecedentedly. "She let an illiterate fool fill her joints with an entire bottle of glue. This is to teach her a lesson. Are you truly certain this will be effective?" As she observed the large basin of water on the dining table, Nina couldn't shake her uneasiness. She glanced between the apprehensive Alice and the stoic Duncan, murmuring quietly, "If this fails, we'll need to use a solvent, but that stuff is caustic, and I'm unsure if it'll harm Alice's body," Duncan said, frustrated as he looked at the Gothic doll who had changed back into her usual attire but still had an immobile neck. "Or maybe she'll just remain like this indefinitely." Alice became alarmed and quickly waved her hands. "No, let's attempt boiling water first." Nina's eyes darted between Alice and the basin several times before she finally exhaled, hesitantly reaching her hand into the tepid water. She was exceedingly cautious, as though attempting to single out a lone grain of sand from the desert, channeling the intense flame from her inner core to the external world. For a sunny girl with a passionate core of 6,000 degrees, such precision wasn't easily achieved. However, she had been diligently practicing this level of control at every opportunity and had made significant progress. In no time, she succeeded. The water started to boil. Alice looked at Duncan, who returned her gaze. Without any hesitation, they submerged the doll's head into the boiling water. "Allow it to cook for some time," Duncan advised while holding Alice's shoulder, "but if you experience any discomfort, stop immediately." Alice promptly replied, "Glug, glug, glug, glug." Duncan considered for a moment and then glanced at Nina. "I suppose she isn't feeling discomfort." Nina stared at the unfolding scene, unable to resist muttering, "I can't help but find this situation so bizarre." Ads by PubFuture. Duncan sighed, acknowledging that her statement was an understatement. He too found the scene incredibly odd. In the dimly lit, cramped antique shop on the second floor, the pair were boiling a Gothic doll's head in a basin of hot water. The doll continued to gesture, raising her hand and giving a thumbs up to signal that she was all right. Any first-time observer of this scene would report it to the authorities, and upon a second look, they'd contact the church's guardians. Suddenly, footsteps and Shirley's voice approached from the stairway. "I've returned. Mr. Duncan, old man Morris is here again. I told him to come right up." Shirley appeared in the doorway the following instant, and her voice abruptly cuts off at what she saw. In the dimly lit room, Duncan and Nina stood silently beside the basin of boiling water, with the latter's hand still submerged, maintaining the heat. Meanwhile, Duncan gripped Alice's shoulder, pressing the Gothic doll's head firmly into the container with the constant bubbling sound of boiling water. As it so happens, Morris also arrived right after Shirley, catching the scene in the dining area with his own gaze. But instead of freezing in shock, he only nodded as if comprehending the situation like it's a typical day in the antique shop. "Oh, it's the subspace shadow and sun fragment stewing anomaly 099. Holy crap!" Shirley's belated exclamation finally resounded as she nearly leapt in terror at the scene. She hastily covered her mouth as though attempting to force the curse back in, mumbling unintelligibly. "What on earth are you shouting for?" Duncan glared at the startled Shirley. "Was it your suggestion for Alice to pour glue into her neck?" Shirley abruptly grasped the situation, and her initial impulse was to flee, but under Duncan's watchful eye, she dared not move. I mentioned it offhandedly. I didn't think she'd actually go through with it," Shirley's voice quivered. "No sane person would believe that." Duncan was about to retort when he suddenly felt Alice's body sway. He promptly released her, only to see Alice rise straight up from the basin. But only her body did so as her head remained boiling in the basin. "Ah, it worked," Nina exclaimed, surprised. Alice's body stood motionless for a few seconds, then started to grope for her head that's gurgling in the water, pleading for help. Help, gurgle, help, gurgle. Ads by PubFuture. Nina quickly retrieved Alice's head and awkwardly helped her reattach it. Hearing the familiar pop sound, everyone present breathed a sigh of relief. Alice rotated her head from side to side, discovering that although her neck was slightly stiff, she could indeed move it. She immediately faced Duncan with a joyful expression. "Captain, I can move again." "Dry her hair and collar, they're both wet." "Help her dry them." Duncan sighed and looked at Nina. He then glanced at Shirley, who appeared panicked and wanted to flee but didn't dare to, and said irritably, "Write the alphabet 20 times and each new word 20 times as well." After saying this, he disregarded Shirley's crestfallen expression and looked directly at Morris. "What's going on? Did you uncover anything new about that symbol?" Morris, possibly still reeling from the peculiar and disordered scene, hesitated for a moment before replying. Not about the symbol. I received some information from a friend at City Hall today, and I think it may pique your interest." "News from City Hall." Duncan furrowed his brow. "Proceed." A few minutes later, Morris relayed the situation he had discovered that morning, at Nobleman at Vision planned. At the dining table, Duncan repeated the phrase with a somewhat serious expression before looking at Morris. "When will this news be made public?" "It's not determined yet, but it should be within the next few days," Morris nodded. "Logically speaking, since the city of Planned is still grappling with the aftermath of the previous calamity, most citizens likely still possess a strong capacity for resilience. Suppose the city is transformed into a vision as part of the post-disaster conclusions. In that case, it may not incite too much turmoil, but if they wait until the city is entirely tranquil and everyone has been living peacefully for a while before announcing it, it might trigger a fresh wave of chaos." Duncan nodded slightly, remaining silent, but couldn't help reflecting on the news he had just read in the newspaper. The Grand Storm Cathedral was scheduled to arrive in Planned. The updates in the records of anomalies and visions were disseminated by the major churches, so the Grand Storm Cathedral must have been among the first to be aware of this situation. A city-state transformed into a vision while continuing to function as usual is quite unusual. What's even more peculiar is that this new vision doesn't have a number, Morris added. "What are your thoughts on this?" Duncan had, of course, noticed the issue of the new vision lacking a number, but what could he think? His knowledge of the supernatural realm was actually inferior to that of a skeletal dog. Ads by PubFuture. However, he couldn't admit that, so he could only contemplate for a moment before shaking his head indifferently. "I have no opinion. The codes of anomalies and visions published by the major churches are unfathomable and meaningless to me." This. Morris opened his mouth but then recalled the green flames that had engulfed the entire city-state, the disintegrating black sun, and the anomaly 099 that had just obediently been submerged in the basin. All these matters seemed to be the same for Captain Duncan, merely some, mildly bothersome, daily issues. There was no need to worry about what every speck of dust cleaned daily was called. "All right, this indeed holds no significance for you." The elderly scholar looked at Duncan with a touch of awe and then hesitated before slowly formulating his words. "Also, although there should be no uncertainty, I still want to confirm that Planned was indeed turned into a vision by your actions, correct?" Duncan turned his face slightly. "Is there any doubt?" "No, I have no doubt. I'm merely curious about your plans for this city-state in the future," Morris stated, organizing his words to convey his thoughts as clearly and unambiguously as possible. "You transformed it into a vision too." "I have no intention of controlling the fate of this city-state or interfering with anyone's future," Duncan interrupted Morris with a gentle shake of his head. "If I must say." He paused, gazing out the window at the tranquil scene on the street. "I quite like this place, so I hope it can remain peaceful in the future." Within the local cathedral, Vanna, who was conversing with Heidi, suddenly stopped and looked back, puzzled. "What's wrong?" Dr. Heidi inquired curiously, observing her friend. "I thought I just heard a bell ringing and someone whispering to me," Vanna frowned. "It seems I must have misheard." "You certainly misheard. I didn't hear anything." Heidi dismissed the idea. "You must be under a lot of stress lately. Do you need me too?" "No need," Vanna interrupted Heidi quickly. I feel like my mental state is quite good, and if I do encounter any problems, I'll handle them myself. You know, priests are part-time psychiatrists. All right, if you don't need it, you don't have to be so anxious, Heidi muttered helplessly. By the way, where was I? Vanna thought for a moment and reminded her, you were just talking about your father purchasing an artillery shell from an antique shop, and now you're concerned about his mental state. Her father once visited an antique shop and spent a significant amount of time there. Upon his return, he held a cannonball in his hands and placed it on the prime spot within his antique shelf. Then from time to time, he would meticulously clean it from top to bottom. Whenever she recalled this fact, Heidi couldn't help but worry about her father's mental well-being. I'm serious, it was so bizarre, the psychiatrist sighed. He treated it like a prized possession, claiming it was an extremely special antique. He would clean the cannonball every day before washing his face. My mother was indifferent, and if I ever mentioned it, she would say, don't bother your father with his hobby. Vanna was unsure how to respond, as she had no expertise in antiques. Her most vivid memory of an antique was accidentally breaking her uncle's vase with a toy sword as a child. Recalling the subsequent punishment, she cautiously said, Mr. Morris is a renowned historian and collector. I assume his collection must hold some unique insights. Still, I've never heard of anyone treating a cannonball like a treasure, even if it's genuine, Heidi sighed. Vanna remained quiet for a moment, seemingly deep in thought. Then she suddenly asked, regarding the pendant, did Mr. Morris get you another identical one? Yes, this one, Heidi nodded and pulled out the crystal pendant from her chest. You've seen it before. I had an identical one, but it was destroyed during the prior disaster. The cleric who documented it at the time surmised that it might be an object that inadvertently gained supernatural power while typically hiding its uniqueness. Vanna studied the crystal pendant Heidi revealed, her expression contemplative. Do you suspect something is amiss? Heidi inquired. After the disaster, the cathedral faced a shortage of manpower, but we still sent people to investigate the antique shop, and everything appeared normal. From the shop's supply chain to the owner's background, there were no red flags. The pendant incident seemed to be merely coincidental, Vanna said slowly, her eyes fixed on the pendant, but I can't shake my concern. Heidi, do you recall when I accompanied you to that antique shop? Of course, I remember, Heidi nodded. Now that you mention it, I do have some ties to that shop. The shop owner once saved my life at the museum. His niece is one of my father's pupils, and my previous pendant came from that shop, but as you pointed out, the church conducted a covert investigation and found nothing amiss. Vanna didn't respond, but after some thought, she reached out. May I take a closer look? Ads by PubFuture. Sure, here you go. Heidi casually handed over the pendant. Vanna took the still warm crystal pendant, inspected it closely in the sunlight, and after a while, she murmured to herself, there's no supernatural aura. Yes, it is just an ordinary pendant, and it's even made of glass, Heidi said, looking at her friend earnestly. Vanna, you're a bit too tense. I know it's an occupational hazard for an inquisitor, but I think the shop owner is really a good person. You shouldn't doubt him. I'm paying attention, not doubting. I always feel that there is something off about that antique shop, but I'm not looking at this matter with the same attitude as an inquisitor towards heretics, Vanna said, returning the pendant to her friend. But you're right, I might be a bit too nervous. Heidi put the pendant back on and then glanced at the mechanical clock hanging nearby. Ah, it's already this time. Are you leaving? At Novelban at. I have to go, Heidi said as she stood up and picked up the small case she had placed nearby earlier. I have an appointment this afternoon. It's with the captain who was under observation at the cathedral for quite some time. Vanna frowned in recollection and quickly found the corresponding memory, the captain of the White Oak. I remember his name is Lawrence. Did he run into trouble? It's normal for a captain sailing the boundless sea, especially at that age, to need the help of a mental health professional, Heidi said, her expression slightly complicated as if she thought of something, but she quickly shook her head. Actually, compared to most captains his age, Mr. Lawrence's situation is not bad. I can't say more, as it concerns the patient's privacy. All right, I hope your work goes smoothly. The first thing Morris did upon returning home was to hug and kiss his wife, and the second thing was to carefully wipe the artillery shell placed on the antique shelf. Ads by PubFuture. Although he felt a bit strange when he brought it home, he knew that this seemingly peculiar collection had its own special meaning. It represented the connection between him and the vanished, as well as Captain Duncan's benevolence towards his dependents. The incredible ghost captain would always convey his goodwill in various odd ways, including but not limited to soup made from deep-sea airs, a shell with a century-old seal, and tutoring the less educated among his dependents in reading and writing. At first, Morris found it strange, but now he has perfectly adjusted his mindset. What Captain Duncan said was right, and what he did was normal. With this mindset, Morris felt that he had completely adapted to the atmosphere of the new team. Suddenly, footsteps sounded from behind. Without looking back, Morris knew it was his wife. "You're almost polishing it to a mirror finish," the elegant old woman laughed as she looked at her husband. "Didn't you say before that antiques shouldn't be wiped too often? But this is no ordinary antique, Mary." Morris turned to his wife and smiled. "It's part of a miracle." The old woman looked up and carefully examined the two special items on the antique shelf, a dagger and a shell. After a moment, she suddenly spoke. "Will you tell your daughter some of the truth later? About this miracle, and about your new identity?" Morris stopped what he was doing with his hands. There were some miracles that could be hidden from others but not from the witnesses of the miracles themselves. Ads by PubFuture. As a product of an incomplete subspace prayer, in the past, his wife had laid on the bed in the form of human ash for 11 years. She was well aware of this. However, now that she had truly survived due to the influence of the vanished, she naturally had doubts about her own survival. There was no way around this. So after getting the captain's permission, Morris told his wife about the vanished, but he did not tell Heidi. "There's no need for it now," Morris said. "Heidi doesn't have to get involved in this matter, and whether to tell or not, it depends on the captain's opinion." Just then, the doorbell rang, interrupting the conversation between Morris and his wife. As the old scholar was about to open the door, his wife stopped him with a smile. "Let me go. I haven't moved for many years, and I need to exercise more now." She turned around and went to the entrance. Then after a brief conversation, she returned to Morris. "It's the mailman." She handed him a letter. "It's for you." "A letter for me?" Morris was a bit surprised. At first glance, he noticed the large denomination stamps and several special postmarks on the envelope and frowned. "I did write to a few distant friends, but I didn't expect a reply so soon, huh?" His action of opening the letter suddenly stopped as his gaze fell on the first postmark on the envelope, which represented the place it was sent from. His expression was a bit strange. "Where is it from?" His wife's curious voice sounded beside him. Morris was silent for 2 seconds and said softly, "Frost." "Frost? That's a very distant place," his wife said, recalling a bit uncertainly. "I remember you had a friend in Frost, named Brown or Bren." "Scott Brown," Morris said slowly, his tone becoming unusually somber and serious, and the movement of opening the envelope with the letter opener became even more hesitant. "Like me, a scholar of history, and also passionate about the field of supernatural." "Oh, right, Scott Brown. I remember him being quite thin and giving people a very meticulous impression," his wife recalled. "Are you still in contact with him?" "I remember he moved to Frost years ago, but before moving, his relationship with you was indeed." "He's already dead," Morris suddenly said. "He died in a shipwreck accident 6 years ago." As his words fell, the room became quiet in an instant.